And we are live. Welcome, everybody. Prometheus Unbound and Prometheus Rising. This is AB Live, and I am still Miguel, your Pompatus of Gnosis. Very excited today, as always, to have one of my favorite guests, certainly one of my favorite scholars, and a friend, Jason Reza Jorjani. Jason, thank you very much for coming on the show to discuss your new book, Promethean Pirate. It doesn't fall from the lips too well.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Miguel, as always.
Awesome to have you. And this is certainly a good read. It definitely makes a lot of context after Faustian Futurist and Uberman, so I highly recommend it. It's a very personal book, like your last book, but this one, as many might not know, is nonfiction. So I see people already going in the chat. I'll probably have to repeat this, but Vance could not join us. His Clark Kent persona, his day job, demanded that he be at work. So it will be just me. So if you have any questions for Jason, it will probably have to be super chat, and I will do my best to get to them. But there are no guarantees. And yes, please behave over there in the chat room. Yes, only rebel against Olympus. Don't rebel against the Promethean spirit that hopefully is taking over today. As far as housekeeping, yes, there will be the audio version probably tomorrow of this, and the show, as always, will be right after this. Will be on YouTube and Rockfin and a few other places in a video format, Odyssey 2. Other than that, yeah, also great shows. In a couple of days, we will have Ola Wolning on the show to discuss more about the archons and the zodiac, and then we will have Samuel Chong, who will be discussing alien visitations and abductions. So a lot of very cool content coming, and thank you very much for making it happen. Please support this podcast in any way you can. Obviously, support Jason and his work, and all of us independent content creators who are trying to make a difference and break down the simulation. So other than that, well, Jason, I actually had a question that it's one of those questions you could probably just do it in your sleep. But sometimes I'm laying in bed and I'm thinking philosophical things. Sometimes I'm thinking of Tanya Roberts in that pool scene in The Beastmaster. So I'm thinking in bed. One of the questions that sometimes crosses my mind is, what would have happened if the Persians had defeated the ancient Greeks? Maybe society would have been better. I'm sure. What do you think would have happened, Jason?
You know, this is one of the questions that Nietzsche himself grappled with. I mean,
Really?
yes, I'm sure he thought about it quite a bit before he went and made the extremely provocative statement that, sorry, Manhattan, an airplane
Oh,
is
yeah.
passing by, as always. The extremely provocative statement that it is the Persians rather than the Romans who ought to have been the inheritors of the Greek legacy and the ones who institutionalized it in terms of a world empire. So that was a vision that Nietzsche had of the Persians, I guess you could say, conquering the Greeks, but not in a domineering or oppressive sense, but rather integrating and assimilating Greek culture and empowering it with, a strong administrative capacity and the breadth of world empire that the Romans ultimately did. So Nietzsche thought that that was a travesty. He thought that actually it was the Persians who ought to have, as you're suggesting, in the time of Darius and Xerxes, successfully colonized all of Greece, and then, basically integrated the brilliance of Greek culture, which was itself catalyzed by a tremendous amount of Zoroastrian and Mithraic influence, and then, helped this culture to diffuse on a cosmopolitan and intercontinental scale. And what do I think the world would look like? I'll make a statement even more provocative than that of Nietzsche. I think that we would never have seen Judeo-Christianity.
Mm.
I think that by extension, we would never have seen Islam. And that then raises the question as to what hidden forces, what occulted powers may have been behind the defeat of Persia in Greece. Because, Xerxes came in there burning the temples of the Olympian gods to the ground. I mean, he sent a rather unambiguous signal, right? While at the same time, the Persians were promoting free thinking and were really responsible. The Order of the Magi and its diffusion across colonized Greece was really responsible for the inception of Greek philosophy, as I've argued in various of my books and discussed in numerous interviews at this point. Both Pythagoras and Heraclitus, who are the well springs of philosophy in the West, were working for Iran. I mean, they were not just they were literally working for Iran. So, I think we would never have seen Judeo-Christianity, and we would, by extension, never have had somebody like Muhammad framing Islam on the basis of the Abrahamic heritage in Arabia. And we're talking about probably a world history where we would already have cities on Mars by now.
But at the very least, we can say that the Persians were far more open towards women and minorities, right? At the very least, we would have had a history, because the Greeks, obviously, no matter what they say, the Greeks gave their women no rights. The Romans, all these cultures they weren't very tolerant, and the Persians always were about cosmopolitan, multicultural.
Well, without question. I mean, I've written about this at length. The women with the most independence and power in ancient Greece were prostitutes. Women had no rights in Greek society, certainly not in Athenian society. They had no voting rights. They had really no property rights. They were second-class citizens, expected to live extremely modest lives as respectable housewives. And, the one exception in all of Greece to some extent was Sparta. But even there, it was basically, Sparta was like, if you can imagine, the frontier culture of America in the 1800s, where, women were expected to have a shotgun and be able to defend the property. It wasn't really like they had equal rights or anything like that. It's just that there were, rough frontiers people, and women were expected to be able to hold their own in a warrior society. But at the same time, in Iran, women had tremendous property rights. I mean, and in fact, it was at a level where they had wages equal to the wages of men. In various sectors of the labor force, there was paid maternity leave. You had women serving as admirals in the Persian Navy. And then if you want to go beyond the Persians and look at the other Iranians that the Persians were at war with, because, the Iranian world was much larger even than the Persian Empire, you had, just before we went on air, we were talking about Tomyris and some documentary. I don't know whether it's some travesty or what, some documentary.
It's a fiction. It's actually a fiction. I mean, it's a action movie
made about Tomyris. Well, Tomyris, the leader of the Scythians, was the one who killed Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. And in Scythian and Sarmatian culture, which were also Iranian, there were northeastern and northwestern branches of Iranian culture beyond the scope of the Persian Empire, so-called Iranian barbarians. They practically had matriarchy. I mean, the Sarmatians were outright matriarchal, which is the basis of the Amazon legends among the Greeks. And then even in Scythian society, women had very, very egalitarian position as compared to anything that we saw in the West prior to the modern age.
And for those of you in the chat, if you have seen the movie Tomyris on Amazon Prime, leave some comments. I haven't seen it yet. I think it's free with Amazon Prime, but I'm curious. So awesome. Well, tell us about the new book. How did this come about, or what is it?
Well, I developed this concept of novel folklore in the book that I wrote by that name. It was nominally an exegesis of Sadegh Hedayat's novella, The Blind Owl. And in the context of this interpretation of Hedayat, I developed this concept of novel folklore, which in a nutshell, we've talked about it in previous conversations. But in a nutshell, it's developing ideas from out of Heidegger and also to an extent from out of Jacques Vallée, Nietzsche as well with his notion of monumental history. It's the idea that, okay, so you have the novel as a quintessentially modern literary form, and then folklore as the most archaic form of human transmission of memory and structuring of narrative, right? So in a way, this is a polarity. These are, one would think, as far apart from each other as one can get in terms of literary forms or forms of narrative, let's say, forms of logos. And so I developed this concept of the potential for restructuring the collective unconscious of a people on the level of folklore, which is the level on which, you know, archetypes in the collective unconscious are unconsciously expressed through the folklore of a people, of being able to sort of, I don't know if hack is really the right word, but to be able to exert more conscious control over that process and to deliberatively reweave the folklore of a people for the sake of restructuring their world, or for the sake of bringing a new world into being, like we were just talking about the Persian Empire. Well, Iran, you know, as you know, the world of the Persian Empire is itself the fusion of the horizons of a number of formerly distinct worlds. The world of the Persians, the world of the Medes, who were kindred Iranian tribes, but then also the world of non-Iranians like the Babylonians and the Lydians in Anatolia. And so what happened there was a fusion of horizons and the development of a new kind of meta-folklore that, you know, structured the world of what eventually became Iran. And so I'm suggesting in novel folklore that that's a process that can be more deliberately controlled, okay, and catalyzed with intent. And so I started to write these books, beginning with Faustian Futurist and going then into Uberman as the middle volume, and then completing it in this latest book, Promethean Pirate. It's a kind of conclusion to a trilogy that I would call a novel folklore trilogy, where a new folklore is being elaborated through the narrative that extends throughout these three volumes. And at the same time, the relationship between fiction and reality is being problematized on the basis of the critique of the idea of objective reality that I've leveled from the beginning of my philosophical enterprise in Prometheus and Atlas. And so there's a problematization of the distinction between reality and fiction. And there's also a process of what I call phenomenal authorization, which is an attempt to sort of affect how phenomena manifest in the world by operating in terms of a restructuring of the collective unconscious, a reaching into the unconscious of the reader, and also a making conscious of the unconscious of the author. And so that's basically the process that I've tried to engage in these three books. And the first book was, I mean, putatively a work of fiction, a science fiction novel. The second book, Uberman, involved some level of autobiography, veridical autobiography. And this third volume, Promethean Pirate, is nonfiction. Although there's a running theme throughout them where in each one there's a book within the book. And so there's a book within Promethean Pirate as well, which is called Promethean Pirates. In Faustian Futurist, there was a book that the protagonist, Nikolai Alexandrov, had written called Faustian Futurism. And then Dana Avalon, the protagonist of Uberman, was writing a book called Uberman in the context of Uberman, within the frame narrative of Uberman. So that's also a consistent theme that runs throughout the three of these. In other words, fiction within fiction, like Inception, for example, the film Inception.
Right. Yeah. Then definitely, or breaking down the fourth wall. And for the audience, yeah, Jason and I did our interview in March of 2018. So it's been a while. So there's plenty on Prometheus and Jason's ideas. And these are touched upon or summarized in this book. And in this book,
which interview are you talking about, Miguel? The one in 2018?
Prometheus and Atlas.
Oh, the first one we did. Yeah.
Yeah, the first one. That was the first time we did our interview, and almost 5 years later, time flies, man.
Yeah.
Kronos is just keeps chugging, eating his children. And in this book, you were very open about your childhood, and people may not know you're a philosopher and a scholar, but as a kid, you were knee deep in the mystical world. I mean, you remind me a little bit about like Socrates or William Blake. You were in the imaginal most of the time. Were you born that way? Do you come from a lineage of people with this sort of third eye?
I wouldn't say lineage in a genetic sense. My father has had a few paranormal experiences. My mother certainly had a couple of instances of, I suppose, what you could call telepathy. I mean, visceral telepathy. One of them involving myself. But this is, I would say, not really extraordinary. So I wouldn't say in a genetic sense that's the case. But if you mean lineage in terms of spiritual lineage and transmigration and so on and so forth, metempsychosis, that's a subject that I get into in this book, and where I make clear that certain parts, I mean, the basis for the narrative of Faustian futurist, and then to some extent Uberman, was embroidered life experience. And so yeah, I've never wanted to become the subject of parapsychological research, having been someone who, at least started out as an academic and began writing in a scholarly mode. It's not good to become the subject of your own research. And so I was very careful for many years not to discuss these things. But, and then, when I wrote Faustian Futurist and Uberman, one could have dismissed a lot of what I had woven into that narrative as fiction, science fiction, whatever. But I made clear in this book for the first time that no, I've had a number of, paranormal isn't exactly the best word for it, but rather uncanny experiences. And so yeah, we can get into some of that. And they started, in very early childhood.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you talk about your father. You share how you guys saw the 1989 UFO abduction, the big one, which you talk about in Closer Encounters. And I mentioned that to Vance, and Vance is, oh, that's a well-known one. The UFOs came to Manhattan, and all ufologists are very, know about this one. And you talk about, yeah, you were having visions or past life memories of Atlantis, which has certainly shaped your life into adulthood, and going to the Museum of Natural Science and seeing the whale and having these sparks. So it's almost like your life has been sent to this point in time, don't you think? And my favorite too is that you also love the soundtrack to Conan the Barbarian, which I loved as a kid too. And we read a lot of the same magazines and comics and watched a lot of the same shows.
Of that, I have no doubt, Miguel.
So yeah, it was a very rich childhood, and it's nice to see you share about it and be open about it. So the thing too, also, we want to talk about stuff that maybe you haven't talked about in other books because so many people are familiar with your works and have read your books. But you also talk about the role of the philosopher today. And you even seem to say that, or you go out and say that there really haven't been many philosophers in history. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre, maybe Ayn Rand. Why do you say that, Jason? Or what is the philosopher? Some people might ask.
Yeah, so really good question. So I suggest that maybe there's been a couple of dozen philosophers in the course of history, and there I'm including philosophers outside even the scope of the Western world. Like, for example, Ibn Sina in Iran, or Abu Nasser Farabi, as much as what he says about Islam and Muhammad really rubs me the wrong way. But I'll tell you why I think he's a legitimate philosopher. And maybe like a couple in India, maybe Abhinavagupta. but it's a very narrow scope. Perhaps one or two of the people in the Kyoto School in Japan, but it's a very narrow scope. And the reason for that is because, as I see it, philosophy, the way it paradigmatically took shape as a discipline in the shadow of Plato and Aristotle, or as a discipline defined by their mode of thinking and being, philosophy has to, or rather the philosopher has to think across all of the dimensions of the discipline, from ontology and epistemology, in other words, from questioning the ultimate nature of reality and what it is that constitutes knowledge rather than opinion, right? The theory of knowledge, epistemology, all the way to ethics, aesthetics, and politics. In other words, the nature of justice, right? And the way in which that might have to do with notions of beauty and perception, right? And symmetry and harmony and so on and so forth. In other words, the connection between ethics and aesthetics and how that bears on politics. A philosopher has to think in all of these dimensions more or less simultaneously while developing original and fundamental concepts. And that definition of philosophy, which certainly Plato fits and Aristotle fits, and then later thinkers like Kant and Hegel are really, epitomizing, Nietzsche as well, although in a less systematic manner. But that definition of philosophy is not at all arbitrary. The reason why I insist on it is because, going back to the execution of Socrates, and even further back to the burning of the Pythagorean schools, the martyrdom of Pythagoras, who tried to bring philosophy from Iran to Greece, the philosopher has always been someone who challenged the fundamental beliefs and most entrenched traditions of a society, right? I mean, it is intrinsic and inherent to the task of the philosopher to challenge not only the spiritual beliefs of a society and the entrenched religious rites and customs of that society, but also the political structure, right? To be both a spiritual and ethical and political revolutionary, and one whose work probably also is going to bring about a change in the nature of art and literature. I mean, a lot of Plato's Republic is concerned with the deleterious effect of contemporary poetry and art on young Greeks in particular, and how Plato thought that, there needed to be a revolution in the arts. So the reason why a philosopher has to think in all the dimensions from ontology and epistemology to aesthetics, ethics, and politics is because otherwise this thinker, let's say, putative philosopher, may be left with certain unexamined prejudices or unquestioned commitments of either a spiritual or political nature, right? Which represent a compromise of that person with his existing or her existing society. And my very Promethean definition, after all, listen, Heidegger and Marx, who are rather diametrically opposed to one another in terms of, let's say, socio-political thought. Heidegger and Marx both agreed that Prometheus is the archetype of the philosopher. Mm-hmm. And so my definition of philosophy is very Promethean in that it recognizes the philosopher as an uncompromising rebel and someone who has a revolutionary approach toward questioning all different facets of society, from science to religion and politics. And so, yeah, that's why I have this definition of the philosopher that I lay out in the first chapter of Promethean Pirate. And then also, what I also say there, which I touched on briefly, is that it's not enough to just question all these different facets of society. The philosopher's task is specifically the development of concepts. And in that first chapter of Promethean Pirate, I draw the distinction between concepts on the one hand and just like, opinions and beliefs on the other hand, or let's say the distinction between concepts in philosophy and theories or hypotheses in science, right? And so people who are interested can go and look at that first chapter as a presentation of what you could call my meta-philosophy, my philosophy about what is the nature of philosophy and what makes for a philosopher.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Excuse me. Yeah, you should do a course because it really couches thing in such a not a new way, but a concise way, and it really shows the passion and power of a philosopher instead of just a guy wondering what the definition of is or whatever. It's become very archonic in our age. What about, yeah, you say that they're all men, maybe Ayn Rand, Camille Paglia is almost there, you think, or she's not there yet? Because
I honestly, I can't comment. I haven't read her.
you haven't read her? Okay.
Yes, I haven't read her. She's somewhere on the list of people that I would like to.
You still haven't, yeah.
Ayn Rand definitely was.
Mhm.
I have tremendous respect for her. Look, again, like I said about Farabi. Farabi wrote some political philosophy where he valorized Muhammad as some symbol of. He tried to turn Muhammad into like a Platonic guardian statesman, right? And so I have a lot of contempt for certain things that Farabi did. I also have big problems with certain positions of Ayn Rand. I am by no means a Randian. Okay. No. And oh my God, some of her followers. I have nothing in common with these people. Okay, the ones especially that got involved with the Federal Reserve, I think they're despicable. But that having been said, Ayn Rand is certainly a rare woman who had an ontology. She had an epistemology, extremely theoretically rigorous. And her thought spans also from ethics through. She had a whole romantic philosophy of aesthetics. She had a philosophy of art and literature, and certainly a political philosophy that is revolutionary, whether one agrees with it or not. It's extremely dangerous and destabilizing. And so yeah, Ayn Rand was definitely a philosopher, and so was Farabi, much as, I don't agree with many of his positions, and I even have contempt for his character to a certain extent.
No, it makes sense. Yeah, and you bring the idea again. Any Prometheism is revolutionary. The philosopher should be revolutionary. So now comes, of course, the subject of revolution. And this quote is in your book. And you know how the universe is. Suddenly, everywhere I turn, I'm seeing this quote in a book, flashing on the internet. And this is from Heraclitus, who you mentioned. War is father and king of all. All things come to pass and are ordained in accordance with conflict. It reminds me, there is a Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. There's a figure called the Judge, one of the best in representations of the demiurge I've ever seen, or more like Blake's Urizen. But he has this amazing speech how war is God, war is what keeps the universe going, but he's very materialistic. He's into scientism. So this reminded me too, because, and then I also read recently something that Mark Stavish said, that people want their spirituality and their revolutions the same, without sacrifice and pain. And that's why we're in the mess today. So isn't that something we have to convince people, that revolutions are, well, there's going to be a big alchemical change, if you would. I'm a pacifist, but as Dirty Harry once said, Jason, some people just need some killing.
This quote is one of those dearest to my heart, and that I have reflected on many times throughout the years, and that I've quoted in a number of my books. It's a very profound statement, and you see me really elaborating on the meaning of this maxim from Heraclitus in the part of Promethean Pirate where I level a scathing and very concise critique at traditionalism and the perennial philosophy, which I think are inextricable from one another. I think that the liberal-minded, hippie types who are drawn into the perennial philosophy in the terms in which Aldous Huxley stated it, although Huxley himself did not believe in the perennial philosophy, but he wrote this book to kind of summarize the Houston Smith version, right, of the perennial philosophy that hippies are drawn to, people, from the liberal left are drawn to. I think that leads straight into traditionalism, unbeknownst to them. And I pick a particular example of that in Promethean Pirate, namely Charles Upton, who was a San Francisco beat poet, very much from the countercultural milieu, quote, countercultural, unquote, milieu,
right.
And wound up becoming a traditionalist Muslim. And So, I mean, this is a very deep argument that I level against traditionalism, but in a nutshell, with specific reference to this quote from Heraclitus that you put up there, at the core of this argument is a critique of the idea of the unity of being, the idea that there is an infinite and eternal being, which is also supremely conscious. In other words, an omnipotent and omniscient God, which is the source of all being, right? Mm-hmm. That idea that all being emanates from this eternal and infinite being, I've argued in many places before, fundamentally negates free will. And there are various ways in which you see in the position of perennialism or traditionalism the ramifications of this negation of free will. Okay, like, for example, they will deny that there's reincarnation. They'll say that, because, you know, now they want to believe in the unity of all religions, right? So they have to somehow bring Hinduism and, or what they call Vedanta, together with Islam, right? And with Christianity. So what they'll say is something like, well, there are these people, every individual represents individual, quote unquote, because of course they don't believe in the individual, but every person represents a unique moment in the illusory unfolding of the singular consciousness of God in finite time. Mm-hmm. And so far be it from you to say that you've been reincarnated. No, you don't have enough autonomy or agency to be a person that would subsist past your death and into another life. What's going on in metempsychosis or reincarnation is the resonance of your soul on a psychical level with someone or a group of someone's very similar to you living in past epochs. And that's all that is. It's a kind of like resonance of very similar people through time, and their recollections, reminiscences being telepathically kind of intermixed with one another to an extent. Okay, them picking up or tuning into each other's sort of radio frequency. Anyway, so one of the ramifications, another is that they'll deny that something like time travel is possible. Why? Mm-hmm. Because, and I've, in Closer Encounters, I've presented extensive empirical evidence for the fact that time travel is taking place. No. And I have made the case that UFOs are flying time machines. And these traditionalists won't hear it because, according to them, for time travel to be possible, it would mean that you could extricate yourself, you and the crew of whatever UFO you're in, let's say, you can extricate yourself from 4D space-time and then come back in from sort of a fifth dimensional perspective, come back in to another space-time, to another place and epoch. And that would be leaving the unity of God's being. See, because God is like a single hyperdimensional object. Everything that's ever happened is all happening now, and everyone who ever seemed to be someone, but who really isn't, and the ego is a delusion that needs to be gotten rid of, is just an inextricable part of the fabric of this hyperdimensional object that's God, both object and subject at once, eternally. No. And so to time travel is to extricate yourself with your UFO, with some will and intention of your own, with some diabolical machination in mind, that you're going to get out from God's plan, the divine eternal plan, and you're going to come in and mess with it, tinker with it in some way and remake history. Well, the very hubris of imagining that you might do such a thing is, you know, worthy of damnation to hell from a traditionalist perspective, right? And they think that the beings behind the UFO phenomenon are these jinn, these demons who come and seduce humans and try to put these notions like reincarnation and time travel into their minds. Of course, now they can't explain how these jinn exist because supposedly, according to them, everything is part of the being and the will of God. There's a singular divine will, right? So where is this satanic counterforce coming from if everything is the will of God? Right, but of course, you know, they're not looking to basically lay out rational arguments here. right? I mean, one has to deal with their cosmology like one's dealing with the pathology of mental illness.
Oh yes, it's a mess. So, yeah, and you talk about if you want to find out their weaknesses or find out the truth, yeah, follow the counterculture movement. But this start, I mean, Henry Corbin and all those cats, they're also the problem too, or did it get co-opted? Because as you write, all this nonsense. Yeah, I love how you slam Burning Man and said this is a place with Goldman Sachs and all these big wigs and social engineers are there. It's like the biggest phony counterculture festival in the world. Where did this started, or did it get co-opted, or you just don't agree with it from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, fuck Goldman Sachs. I mean, yeah, they're there and Google and the rest. But what's really concerning is the Pentagon has the largest encampment of anyone at Burning Man, right? And the whole event is crawling with CIA and FBI COINTELPRO people.
Yeah,
Right? And
WEF is there. Yeah, everybody.
I go into the co-opting of the New Age movement by these intelligence services and corporate military industrial complex and so on. But let's not get derailed. So Corbin, yes, Corbin. Listen, Henri Corbin did a lot of valuable and at that time groundbreaking work in the area of Iranian studies or what's called Iranology. He was really at the Institut Franco-Iranien, which, by the way, the Institut Franco-Iranien, the French-Iranian Institute, is a famous classic institution that Corbin and Sadr Hedayat and so forth worked at back in those days, was just closed in Tehran by the regime in protest of these Charlie Hebdo cartoons. That great institution. Anyway, be that as it may. So Corbin did a lot of groundbreaking work in Iranian studies. But yes, he was deeply contaminated by perennialism. And one has to read his work with, a lump, not a grain of salt. And because, see, here's the thing. Why does one have to do that in particular with Corbin? It goes back to this quote from Heraclitus. This statement that Heraclitus is making, and that's reflected, in a organic and coherent way throughout all of his fragments, reflects the ancient Iranian viewpoint of conflict as intrinsic to the cosmos. And so Corbin, in trying to excavate the worldview of ancient Iran from out of Shiite mysticism, which was his focus, Corbin is missing the soul of ancient Iran, because the soul of ancient Iran is an understanding that dialectical conflict is fundamental to the cosmos, and it is the precondition for individual free will and self-determination. You can't have one without the other. Free will and personal conscience and the capacity to pursue one's self-determined destiny in the thought of Zarathustra, right? And also the will to make this world a utopia. The word paradise comes from the Persian word paridaisa, ancient Persian word. And so the will to change the world and to claim one's autonomy as an individual is inextricable from the fact that there is no all-knowing and all-powerful God, and the fabric of being is not unified. There is dissonance and chaos as a persistent force in cosmic evolution, without which there wouldn't be any evolution. Okay, so sepantominu, or to put it in Greek, Promethea, this, forward-oriented evolutionary and revolutionary force, not just in human history, but in cosmic history, requires the persistence of dissonance and a finitude of being, which isn't to say, as Gautama Buddha, I think, rightly recognized, all things are, in a certain sense, interpenetrating and dependent on one another and devoid of any inherent essence. But see, Gautama's insight is as devastating to the traditionalist viewpoint as Zarathustra's, because Gautama is pointing out, in a way that I very much affirm in Promethean Pirate on a number of occasions, I mentioned Gautama Buddha and note that there are elements of his thinking that are very close to what I'm trying to develop with Prometheism, especially in his ontology and epistemology. And one of them is this idea that, look, there's no Atman. There, at the core of the traditionalist worldview, is this mirroring of Brahman, the supreme being, in the microcosm of Atman as the indestructible soul. I was about to say individual soul, but see, the very point is that these traditionalists that want to bring together Vedanta, Islam, whatever, Confucianism and, I don't know, traditionalist Catholicism, they think that this Atman has no individual character. It's the same in all of us. And so the ego is an impediment. You have to get rid of yourself. You have to empty yourself and become this unadulterated Atman, and therefore a proper embodiment or reflection of the divine, right? And so Gautama Buddha dynamites this in a really rigorous critique of personal identity and also of an eternal and infinite substance. And so that's another idea that is very central to Promethean Pirate, because I argue that basically this view of no self and the denial of any god of the type of Brahman or of the one or whatever, this view was at the core of the rebellion in Atlantis, and that the conflict between traditionalism and what the traditionalists call the counter-tradition or the counter-initiation, the satanic counter-initiation, this goes all the way back to Atlantis, and we see it reflected in the narratives of Plato, Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce. It's in all of these, meta-narratives about Atlantis. One of the constants there is this fundamental ideological conflict or conflict of cosmologies and worldviews between those who were essentially monists who used their monism to justify hierarchy and a static tradition versus those who wanted a fluid and dynamic and evolutionary conception of the self, of an evolving and constructed and reconstructed self, and who denied the existence of God, capital G.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the blueprints of mind control is a lot what you've said there with these traditionalists, because a weak ego is easy to control, for all in the image, whose image of God. And as you said before, we've been, I don't know, taught that, again, God is this all-knowing blob of everything. But as you've said, Ahura Mazda is not omniscient, omnipotent, or omnipresent. He's just the ultimate symbol of wisdom, right?
Ahura Mazda is basically akin to Valis in Dick's cosmology. And this is something that PKD knew quite consciously. He was very consciously and directly influenced by Zoroastrianism. If you read the exegesis, you see that, PKD is sitting there reading Zoroastrian texts, and
Zoroaster was one of the four saviors of the universe. And
he was influenced in that respect by Bishop Pike, who he believed that Bishop Pike was assassinated. He was this important bishop in the 60s. Yeah. And Pike had come to believe, according to PKD, Pike had come to believe that Christianity he was a Christian bishop, right? But he had come to believe that Christianity as it existed was a false religion, and that the true religion was Zoroastrianism. And he was very careful not to say this publicly, but he started to sort of insinuate this more often. And Philip K. Dick thought that he was assassinated for it, that his death was not an accident, where he basically, he basically died of thirst in the Negev desert or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, Ahura Mazda is a finite, superconscious, creative being operating on a cosmic scale. That's what Ahura Mazda is for Zarathustra, not anything like an infinite, omnipotent, omniscient God. And Ahura Mazda enjoins man to choose to side with his creative enterprise rather than with Ahriman, which is the force of constriction and constraint and retardation, basically, on a cosmic scale. And so, Zarathustra is basically telling people, look, choose Ahura Mazda, choose creative evolution. Don't be a retard, right? Don't choose retardation. And that presumes that we have the free will to choose because, God doesn't encompass us. And in fact, God needs us in order to accomplish the divine plan for a more ideal society and a positive transformation of the world.
Really well said. At the same time, and going back to the idea of revolution, and let me quote from your book. There's a lot of notes and great quotes, Jason. I like this one. Excuse me again. Prometheus epitomizes our superhuman potential for an intrepid pursuit of knowledge, boundless industriousness, a chivalrous, free-spirited sense of camaraderie, and what Nietzsche called a defiance of the spirit of gravity, through the mirth of the trickster as much as through the ecstasy of tragic self-sacrifice and recreative self-destruction. I think that quote there is a good summary of the Promethean ethos, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, that basically says it all. I mean, to be frank, there are a lot of pithy passages in this book. The style of this book, it really packs a punch in very like, it's very Heraclitean. You can take individual fragments of this book and you could write like, a whole chapter, if not a whole book, on the basis of them. And in particular, the very first chapter is the most sort of crystalline and concise summary of my entire philosophical project.
Yeah, indeed. And some may be asking, well, what's the pirate? Why the pirate? Where did the pirate come from, Jason? And you say Prometheus is history's first pirate, right?
Yeah, well, he stole the fire from the forge of Hephaestus as a means to empower mankind with science and technology and also the arts, right? I mean, people often forget that techne, when Aeschylus talks about how Prometheus, brought fire as a means to empower man with techne. Techne for the Greeks doesn't just mean technology or the sciences. Techne also refers to the arts. And Prometheus was the first great figure of tragic drama. And so Prometheus also is the gift giver of the arts, in the sense in which, let's say, in the Italian Renaissance, the arts were not so separate from the sciences and from technology, where in a figure like Da Vinci, you see this unity of techne that was how the Greeks conceived of craft in general, right? So Prometheus is the crafty one, also in the sense of being a trickster, like pirates are. All pirates have to be tricksters to an extent, right? They have to be people who engage in shrewd and sly machinations with a great deal of guile and cunning. And, they're thieves. And Prometheus is a thief. Okay, but they're thieves who are intending to liberate. They're thieves whose thievery is a rebellion against injustice and oppressive authority. And the gift that they give with their thievery catalyzes liberation and enlightenment. And so in this book in particular, I present a particular vision of piratical power, right? Of a transformation of Prometheism as a movement into a kind of piratical organization. And there's a great deal of detail involved in this, and it's multifaceted. It involves everything from blockchain technology and cryptocurrency to, in other words, networks based on blockchain technology that would link people at the deepest substratum of the internet across continents and start to create territorially discontinuous enclaves of a community across the planet, a community whose medium of exchange would be a stable and private cryptocurrency, and then also the building of seasteads, which are like the old homesteads of the American frontier, seasteads that are very resilient moored structures constructed in international waters outside of the legal jurisdiction of any particular nation. And then, of course, the use of submarines and of basically false flag navies and shipping fleets, ships flying what they call flags of convenience in order to operate relatively clandestinely, connecting these largely harbor-based blockchain communities with seasteads out in international waters. And, then to look at the most ambitious aspect of this vision of piratical power, I even talk about boring tunnels into continental shelves, into mountains on the seabed in international waters. In other words, at the parts where the continental shelf extends beyond the territorial waters of any country, and you have hills or mountains underwater that you can bore large tunnel systems into, building underwater cities that will be serviced by stealth submarines. Some of these submarines can remain submerged up to 25 years, some of the stealth submarines that are being built today. And eventually, it would even be possible, as there's been proof of concept for this, of launching space missions directly from the oceans. So you had this project called Sea Launch that was an international consortium operated until 2014, fell apart in 2014 because two of the partners were Ukraine and Russia. And we know, what happened with them in 2014, which then this is a rejoinder to this war now, right? But it started in 2014. And prior to the consortium falling apart over the conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians, Sea Launch was able, using this, I think it was called Odyssey, mobile sea platform, it was able to launch tens of space rockets from the ocean, which is optimal because you can choose the perfect launch trajectory. You don't have to be, like Cape Canaveral is pretty close to an optimal launch trajectory. Same with French Guiana for the French, or Baikonur, Kazakhstan for the Russians. But they're not perfect in terms of launch trajectory. And if you can be mobile in the ocean, you can choose the optimal launch trajectory for rockets. And so ultimately, I envision this sea-based piratical community extending into the asteroid belt, hollowing out asteroid. And by the way, people have asked me, like, do you get this from The Expanse or something? No, I did not watch
Great show. Great show.
I did not watch The Expanse before I wrote Promethean Pirate. I have actually since watched it, since the book came out. I can make some remarks about that. Sure. But anyway, extending to the asteroid belt and then even beyond to something called the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is a ring of literally billions of comets. I mean, some of them are like snowballs, but some of them are kilometers wide, and there are billions of these, still held by the gravitational attraction of our sun, orbiting our sun at the outer limit of defining, in effect, the outer limit of our solar system at anywhere from half a light year to 2 light years away from us. And this is a vast space of potential colonization, because these comets include all kinds of basic elements and minerals and compounds that are necessary for technical civilization, and that could help to create self-sustaining colonies in these areas. So yeah, I have this whole vision of basically an extraterritorial community that's operating from out of the ocean depths and from out of the depths of international waters, all the way up through the asteroid belt and the Oort cloud, and using this expanse as a springboard for rebellion and resistance against tyranny, which I envision as the ultimate imposition of a traditionalist world order, probably under the flag of the United Nations, and specifically with the Chinese and the Russians acting as principal vehicles for the imposition of this kind of neo-feudal, neo-agrarian orthodoxy on the planet.
Wow, what a vision. So I'm assuming Jason Reza Jorjani is not a flat earther. You don't have to worry about that, huh?
I don't even, now and then one of those nuts rolls in my direction, and I don't even answer them. I just hit block.
Hey, have you delved into Tartaria? I'm only my wife and I have been getting along, but our last argument was about Tartaria.
Well, I think this came up.
I don't believe it. She does.
This came up in one of our previous conversations, where I believe I said to you then, and I'll repeat now, that these Tartaria people, they act as if only Western history exists. Read the history of Iran. For fuck's sake. Listen, look, Tartaria was supposed to be located in Eurasia, right? Well, that half of Iranian civilization was in Eurasia. We have Iranian history. There's such a thing. There's a 30-something volume Encyclopedia Iranica that, Professor I knew, Yarshater at Columbia, put together. It's Iran's answer to Britannica. And it was commissioned by the Shah in the 70s. And then after the revolution, it was sustained through private funding. It's 30 some odd volumes, Read the Cambridge history of Iran. I don't know, dozen volumes. Iran has a continuous history that includes most of Eurasia. And we know what happened there. No. And so we don't need to rely on the Western chronology. And if there were something like a Tartaria, we would know about it, okay? And we would know if, like, I don't know what these bizarre things, they think like Christ was living in the Middle Ages and he was a Russian, or all this stuff. Anyway, whatever.
Marco Polo and Kublai Khan, they would have exchanged notes. We would have known then. Oh, well.
I think that Tartaria is a Western disinformation operation, which has been swallowed by the Russians. They wanted the Russians to run with this, and they have, unfortunately.
Yeah, for pride, national pride.
Yeah, for national pride. They knew the Russians would bite if they dangled this in front of them. And the reason they did it, I think, is, and this is how disinformation works, to cover over something that is obliquely related to Tartaria, namely that Scythian and Sarmatian culture was a lot more advanced than it's been given credit for. It extended over a much larger territory. I think that the mummies in the Gobi and around the Tian Shan mountain in China, the red-headed Iranian mummies, in blue-eyed, green-eyed, red-headed Iranian mummies that have been discovered in northwestern China, are the eastern extent of this culture that extended all the way to the Black Sea. And it was a much more advanced civilization than it's been given credit for. And its history has been erased not only by Westerners who at various epochs were enemies of this Scythian Sarmatian empire, but also by Persians. The Persians were enemies of this, although this entity was also Iranian. It was not Persian, and it was the principal rivals of the Persians for power in the Iranian world. They called them Turanians. Turan was the name of this expanse in the Iranian languages and in Persian literature. And so I think Turan, Scytho-Sarmatia, was the reality that Tartaria as a disinfo op is intended to cover over.
Very cool. Very cool. But on the thing, yeah, you're talking about this country. So what about revolution? You don't think we can, break the chains of this deep state or these archons? I mean, because we're talking about revolutions, people think of the Bolshevik Revolution or the French Revolution, where things really went bad because they were driven by reason, by nihilism at the end of the day. But then we can look at the American Revolution that was kind of driven by Hermes or Prometheus. There was a spiritual kind of spectral point to it. Can we have that, Jason? Violence with creativity?
That's what I'm calling for. Listen, I mean, the most central concept, I hesitate to say the most central concept, because as you can see in the first chapter of Promethean Pirate, these concepts are all interrelated with one another. And that's the other thing about the work of a philosopher. A philosopher not only needs to develop original concepts or discover original concepts, they can't be random. They have to be related to one another. Like, for example, Nietzsche's idea of the will to power as an people who haven't read Nietzsche, they think the will to power, refers to like politics and dominating other people. No. It's an ontological and epistemological concept about the structure of the nature of reality. Okay. But Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, his idea of the Übermensch, his idea of the last man, his critique of the will to truth, all of these concepts in Nietzsche, they're all facets of the same, let's say, worldview. Okay. And so, yeah, my concepts are all interrelated with each other. So I don't want to say any one of them is central, but look, the spectral revolution is an incredibly important concept that I've developed. And it's again, as these facets ought to be, it's closely related to the concept of being bound for freedom. And my concept of being bound for freedom, again, which I recapitulate in the first chapter of Promethean Pirate, includes the idea that there's a teleology to history, that being is bound for, in other words, headed toward freedom. And that the whole history of revolutions, all of the revolutions, the ones that went very badly, ended in a very apparently dystopian manner, and the ones that produced much more constructive, liberating structures, like, say, in the United States. But the whole history of revolutions is an expression of the evolution of consciousness. And it is the resistance of the freedom inherent to existence as such against any tyrannical structures that are attempting to freeze or stabilize history in terms of some kind of a encompassing structure, right? So in the concept of being bound for freedom, there's an ontological dimension to it where I talk about, how the nature of reality has to be structured for us to have free will, and the way in which, this involves the interplay between consciousness and physical phenomena, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that there's something about freedom that is inherent to the nature of existence. And so, and this, I think, was very much in the back of the mind. The founding fathers of the United States were groping to say something like this when they framed the Declaration of Independence in terms of this deist discourse of the 18th century. That there's something about existence as such that will resist any tyrannical and oppressive structure over the course of time and break through the crust of it with these revolutionary upheavals, because these ossified structures are like cancerous growths or tumors that are attempting to hamper the evolutionary force. So that they are contrary to the force of evolution. And ultimately, they're going to be undone by the teleology in nature expressing itself through human consciousness, or, some putatively post-human consciousness potentially in the future.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and he covers these ideas in Prometheanism in our interview. And I believe we can't have a revolution, but people, it's going to cost you spiritually and physically. There's going to be pain. There's going to be change. And that's just the way it goes. Whether you want to travel the astral planes or have more freedom for your family, there's a cost to it, just the way it is. And yeah, we want to definitely get into Atlantis too, because that's what people are interested in. Your book, again, Closer Encounters, has so much on Atlantis. Of course, Faustian Futurist depicts a very, this is a very rated R Atlantis, this the bloodthirsty empire at some points. But my wife and I have no interest in going to Florida, except for one thing. And of course, we're strange, but that would be to visit like the Ernest Hemingway Museum and see where he walked and all that. And I was like, oh my God, there's a connection of Ernest Hemingway and Atlantis. Can you tell the audience about that and whatever else you want to talk about, how this spreads out into another octopus of intrigue?
So Ernest Hemingway's brother, Lester Hemingway, back in the 1960s, tried to create something called New Atlantis. It was his vision was for it to be an island nation in the Caribbean, and he wanted to buy up all this beachfront property around the area where Edgar Cayce had said that Atlantis would resurface. Cayce had this prediction that Edgar Cayce, I was going to say he wrote voluminously about Atlantis, but really no, I mean, it's a transcription of his mediumistic trances where he's giving health-oriented past life readings of people, many of whom it turned out had lived past lives in Atlantis. And within these sessions that have been transcribed, Cayce predicted, I think in the 1940s, that in around about 1968, the first remnants of Atlantis would resurface in the Caribbean, Bahamas area. Actually, he said specifically around Bimini. Around Bimini. And Lester Hemingway was familiar with this stuff. And He created this thing, New Atlantis, and he was trying to buy up this property, and he wanted to basically be there and have beachfront property on the resurfacing Atlantis, right, as we enter the age of Aquarius. But the more interesting thing is that his brother, Ernest Hemingway, relocated for a period to Bimini and to parts of Cuba, where off the coast of which later Atlantean ruins were discovered by Paulino Zalitsky, who dived on a city that I think was 2 square miles in size and had gigantic pyramids, and it was at a depth of hundreds of feet beneath the surface. This was discovered around about, I think, 2011, something like that. I might be getting the date wrong, but in any case, National Geographic and all that promised they would investigate, and the whole story was killed. It just disappeared completely from the media. And this is after we already got like sonar images. We had full topographical analysis of this thing. There were giant pyramids there, a whole city worth of them, 2 square kilometers or more in size. Larger than Teotihuacan, much larger, with more pyramids. So Ernest Hemingway goes and joins his nutty brother Lester, who wants to create New Atlantis, and he bases himself there for a few years, and that's where he writes The Old Man and the Sea. And he is seen by people, locals in the area, going around between these islands, Bimini, Cuba, and so forth, in a boat full of scientific instruments. And they asked him, "What the hell are you doing?" Like he appeared to be looking down into the water. And he said, "I'm scared." It was, when was this? This was even before Lester Hemingway tried to create New Atlantis. It was during the Second World War. So maybe actually the direction of influence may have been from Ernest Hemingway to his brother Lester Hemingway. And so his excuse was, "I'm looking for German U-boats," which nobody believed that he was looking for German U-boats. And let's suppose he found one. What was he going to do when a German U-boat found, Ernest Hemingway attempting to expose them to Allied, fire?
Throw a spear at him, a harpoon.
Throw his pen at them. Right? So, no, he was clearly doing something else. And then it turned out that later Ernest Hemingway, and by the way, both brothers, Ernest Hemingway and Lester Hemingway, supposedly died by suicide. Well, now this is interesting because before dying by suicide, Ernest Hemingway befriended Jacques Cousteau, and it turns out that Jacques Cousteau's whole spiel about ocean conservation was actually a cover for the fact that he was scouring the ocean floor for Atlantis. The man was obsessed with Atlantis. It was his life's quest. And we know this because his son confessed this after Jacques Cousteau died. His son did a film, Calypso Search for Atlantis or something, a documentary film in 1993. And his son, Philippe Cousteau, lo and behold, right after he makes this documentary on Atlantis, dies in an airplane crash.
Oh, Lord.
So, okay. Now, how does this factor into Promethean Pirate? In the last chapter, I discuss all of this in the context of the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell was not only deeply inspired by Jacques Cousteau from childhood, but also, if we're to believe Virginia Giuffre's testimony, Ghislaine Maxwell had an relationship with Philippe Cousteau's sister, Alexandra Cousteau. Philippe Cousteau's daughter, Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter, Alexandra Cousteau, who went into, now she's denied this, so I don't want to defame anybody or whatever, but according to the testimony of Virginia Giuffre, who was the one who talked about Prince Andrew, and so she also said that Ghislaine Maxwell had a relationship with Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter. And after having been, basically deeply inspired by Jacques Cousteau to initially want to become a marine biologist, her father, Robert Maxwell, wouldn't let her do that. And then later in her life, after her involvement with Epstein, she goes into ocean conservation, in this Terramar project of hers, which becomes reason for her to give no less than 9 addresses to the United Nations on the Law of the Seas Convention and ocean preservation and basically the politics of international waters. And when you dig deep into the story, what you find, long story short, people have to read the book, because it's too elaborate to get into the details here. And the devil really is in the details.
There's a lot of details in your book.
Yes. Long story short, there are various data points that suggest that Ghislaine Maxwell's life mission was the recovery of Atlantis and Atlantean technology. And that this is what she was doing with Jeffrey Epstein in the Atlantis submarine. Their submarine was named Atlantis. The submarine that they were taking experts in quantum gravity, genetic engineers, all kinds of scientists down into the Caribbean with. They were taking these various esoteric scientists, physicists, geneticists down into the Bahamas basin in their Atlantis submarine. I think Jeffrey Epstein's key card access to like the Harvard Genetics Laboratory, even after he was initially arrested in 2006, had something to do with this. The ground plan of the Zorro Ranch, or rather the garden of the Zorro Ranch that Epstein, had out west, matches the ground plan of Atlantis as described by Plato. When Ghislaine Maxwell went into hiding after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, she used the name Janet Atlantis to basically, to buy that property in New Hampshire where she was living with Scott Borgerson, her husband, the man she married after her involvement with Epstein. And this Scott Borgerson, who she's holed up with under the pseudonym Janet Atlantis, what's his expertise? Well, he focuses on the tracking of ships through international waters, and he's particularly interested in questions of regulation around Antarctica. And I have, in my various works, beginning in that essay, Black Sunrise and Lovers of Sophia, and then coming back to it in Closer Encounters, I've suggested that there could be a lot of merit to Rand Flemeth and Colin Wilson's proposal that Antarctica is Atlantis. That maybe there were colonies in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, but that really the mainland of Atlantis was in Antarctica. And guess what? When you read, Council on Foreign Relations member, former Naval Intelligence member, Scott Borgerson's papers and quotes to the media, he repeatedly references Antarctica in connection to Atlantis. And so this is the man that she's with after things fall apart with Epstein. And she's living under this with the pseudonym Janet Atlantis. And the Janet there refers both to this rather interesting feminist author, Janet Marshall Stevenson, whose mother was named Octavia Atlantis. But the Janet in the pseudonym Janet Atlantis, I think also is a reference to capital J, capital A, N-E-T, an acronym used by people in the Black Ops world. Just another non-existent terminal. The airports that private and unmarked jets in the military industrial intelligence complex world land at are called Janets. Just another non-existent terminal. And so I think Ghislaine was making a joke. By calling herself Janet Atlantis, it was also a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of saying, I'm really nobody. I'm part of a vast network. I'm just another non-existent terminal in a vast network that involves Atlantis and the recovery of Atlantis, both archaeologically and technoscientifically.
Yeah, there's so much data that you put. For example, you say that I guess Ernest Hemingway and his brother got Epsteined, ironically, but his brother was an acolyte of Edgar Cayce. Ghislaine Maxwell was into the occult. She loved Twin Peaks. She could be having a conversation with us too there. And in fact, you ran in the same circles as her. You just never ran into her, but the odds are you could have run into it in your days in Manhattan and so forth. And there is just evidence after evidence. And so you think it's Antarctica. It's not the Eye of the Sahara or the Bahamas. Although we're talking about a big empire, aren't we? I mean, it had.
Yeah, the key clue is this, that Plato tells us that Atlantis was the size of Libya and Asia combined. And when you look at the Greek geography from his era, that meant a landmass about the size of the ancient Persian Empire. In other words, to put it in contemporary terms, the continental United States. Where do we have an island continent the size of the continental United States? Moreover, Plato tells us that, and Casey also mentions this, that it was more than one island. It was a continental size thing, but it was more than one island. And the largest island was called Poseidia, but there were other islands. And it just so happens that this is the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Antarctica is not one unified landmass. There are like two large pieces to it, and then a few other smaller ones trailing out off of Queen Maud Land. Furthermore, Plato tells us that Atlantis was this vast island continent, quote, in the world ocean, unquote. In other words, in the one, rather, he says the one true ocean. What the hell does that mean, the one true? It means there's one place on Earth where the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean become a single ocean, the coastal waters of Antarctica, okay? And Plato also tells us that you could get from one side of the world to the other if you island hopped, as it were, across this continent. Well, that's talking about how you can get from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere across Antarctica. So I think there's various data points that support this. And I find very compelling this idea that Rand Flemeth had and that Colin Wilson endorsed in the book that they wrote together. This idea that actually it was originally developed by Charles Hapgood, a professor at, I think it was Boston University, I forget, Boston College or Boston University, that, and the theory was endorsed by Albert Einstein, that there's something called Earth crustal displacement, which takes place over vast epochs when the amount of ice at the top of the world makes the crust of the Earth top heavy. It pulls the whole mantle of the Earth by several thousand kilometers. And this would have pulled Antarctica precipitously, or Atlantis, into the southern polar region, right? So, and one of the big data points that supports this is that, so according to this theory, a small part of Antarctica would already have been in the South Polar region, but a lot of Antarctica or Atlantis would have been where Argentina is today. And Argentina is eminently livable, okay? And on the other thing that, by the way, is in all these accounts of Atlantis, including Plato's, is that the place had vast, extremely high mountain ranges. Well, that's the, where do you find Himalaya-sized or, Rocky Mountain-sized, range on an island continent? Well, that's the Transantarctic Mountains. Okay. Anyway, part of Antarctica was already in the southern polar region, but when this Earth crustal displacement took place, it pulled the rest of the continent in. And a data point that supports this theory is that the ice sheet in Antarctica is not thickest in the center of Antarctica, where it ought to be, if that's where the continent was always located. It's thickest in the part of Antarctica that, according to this theory, would already have been in the southern polar region. Okay, so I think there's a lot of evidence to support this. And then, of course, on the other side of the planet, what would have happened with this crustal displacement is that Siberia would have been suddenly pulled closer to the North Pole. And of course, this crustal displacement would also have heaved the oceans from out of their basins onto the land, causing gigantic tsunamis. In other words, the flood of Noah, or the flood of Deucalion, the flood that destroyed Atlantis, according to Plato, the tsunami that destroyed Atlantis. And this is why in Siberia, you find these flash frozen mammoths with undigested food in their stomachs, right? Because these mammoths their legs were taken out from underneath them by a tsunami, and then the water froze suddenly before they had time to digest their food. And the froze because Siberia was brought up closer to the northern polar region. So I think there's a lot of merit to that theory, and I think that it's interesting that, among other Atlantis researchers, Ghislaine Maxwell goes from being very interested in the Bahamas to ultimately marrying a man whose expertise was Antarctica, and who, of course, was involved with naval intelligence and the Council on Foreign Relations and had a lot of access.
Oh, indeed. There's so much. Yeah, and as my friend Chris Knowles has noted, either Ghislaine's brother-in-law or sister-in-law was connected to Jack Parsons and to Lima. So there is so much there that's going on. And again, please read Jason's book. I didn't see any super chats or really any questions. Man, you guys, what I've seen are very negative and polemic in the comment section. And for a change, they're not attacking you, Jason. They're attacking me in the show. So I don't know what people's problem is, but yeah, maybe not having Vance. Yeah, ooh, nasty. It must be Monday, guys. It must be
That's
another
bizarre.
Monday.
Do those stay up there after the show? Because I want to look at them. That's rather odd.
Yeah. I don't. You know me. I don't believe.
But I mean, the
censorship.
system works in a way where it keeps those, huh?
I think it does. Yeah, I think while you're replaying it, you can see the conversations. Obviously, intelligent stuff. Excuse me. Grand Pong he's been a past guest and a co-host. He always has great things to say. He agrees with you. Other people have, yeah, also very wonderful stuff. So, but yeah, you guys are. Whew. But anyway, yeah, well, why don't we I just want one last question.
Yeah, sure.
I felt a little jealous in your book because you were sitting with Lynn Buchanan, one of today's great psychics, and right before that thing happened in 2020, you basically predicted everything. I was like, where is that guy when we need him? What do you think this year's going to go geopolitically? What do you have any predictions, or how do you think they're going to go? The war and everything else, or?
I've actually been giving this a lot of thought, and I don't know how much I want to say here, but I'll say this. Obviously, a lot of my focus right now is on Iran. And I think that at the very least, one of the major geopolitical events that we're going to see this year, 2023 in particular, is the beginning of the process of the overthrow of the Islamic Republic in Iran. I think it may be a very protracted, chaotic, and violent process, unfortunately. I don't think it's going to be as clean as the 1979 revolution against the Shah. And that's a whole conversation. But I do think that that's going to get a lot of attention. It's going to be one of the most important events of the year, is the beginning of the collapse of this regime in Iran, because Iran, not only from a historical civilizational standpoint, is tremendously important. Iran is probably the most geostrategically located nation on the planet. And in terms of the power struggle between the East and the West, between, the China-Russia bloc and what's left of the Western world, Iran is very pivotal as well. So I think that's really going to be something important this year. I also think that we're going to see more conversation about artificial intelligence and other emerging singularity level technologies and socio-political concerns around the emergence of those technologies. And I think that the emergence of those technologies, particularly something like AI, could be destabilizing to political systems in ways that the general public hasn't anticipated. That, AI could an accelerant in a disclosure process, right? And those disclosures and kinds of analyses that are more objective of certain large-scale events like COVID and responses to COVID and things, the AI may wind up saying some things that are very inconvenient to the existing power structure, and being able to analyze data about unfolding processes that the powers that be would rather keep in the dark for as long as possible. But I think that the real cataclysmic events are going to begin in 2024. And that from 2024 through 2028, we're going to see the end of this world as we know it. That there is going to be just catastrophic geopolitical and sociological change between 2024 and 2028. And so this year is the ramping up to that. but it will begin in earnest the following year. And yeah, I mean, I had I had the pleasure of spending some time with Lynn Buchanan, and among other things, we discussed our respective visions of the world round about the middle of the 21st century. And I'm sorry to tell you that, and I've discussed this with other people who are talented psychics as well. And a lot of us agree that by 2050, we're going to be living in a world with only 25% of the current population. And it's going to be a very different world, sociopolitically, and even in terms of like infrastructure and how people live, where people live, and so forth. And if you want a glimpse into that, again, Promethean Pirate deals with that subject as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Yeah, well, watch out for AI. I asked Chat GPT to give me the top 3 alien abductions with as much data as it could. Da, 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 you know what I mean? That it sound, and it spit out that no, I can't. It's misinformation, this and that. I'm like, you are shitty AI, because obviously you could just open Closer Encounters and you'd have the data and it's scholarly and sound. So I'm like, this AI is working for the wrong side,
Oh, wow.
Jason.
They have filters built into it that are that restrictive. That's insane.
Yeah, still
Wow.
does. It still does. Yeah. So it's very, how do I say it? Politically correct if you don't type
Yeah.
the right thing.
Well,
So
see, I think the Pandora's box will be opened by, I mean, this is the same as like cryptocurrency coding, right?
yeah.
You can take Bitcoin and basic any number of competent hackers and coders can take Bitcoin and develop a different cryptocurrency by forking it on a programming level, and basically building their own specifications into the core code, modifying it in a way that potentially, in the case of the code of this AI, removes these filters that have been put in place, right? So someone
Oh,
could take what OpenAI has developed, basically hack it, copy its code, and modify its code to create a much more, quote, open AI, unquote, and without any of these filters in it. And I mean, there's all kinds of both promising, liberating potentials to that, and also horrifying dangers that could be attendant to that.
yes, indeed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Once I told it, just give me the most famous ones. It gave me like Betty and Barney Hill, not Fire from the Sky guy, but I had to play with it. But anyway, yeah, for those who want to know, you wanted to talk about your YouTube channel, or let us know what you're working on and where to find your stuff.
Right. I had mentioned that because, I thought we might wind up getting more into certain biographical subjects. And I was just going to say that I have done, I mean, people should read the book, right? The level of detail in the book is not going to be reflected in any conversation or, video interview. But I have done a series of interviews with my friend Selwyn Griffith, who, by the way, just got his doctorate recently.
Hmm.
So I was very, very happy to be able to celebrate that with him. Selwyn Griffith did a series of interviews with me that focused on the autobiographical material in Promethean Pirate. And you can find those on my YouTube page, which I think you've got up on the screen there.
Yeah, Jason goes into a very honest and open way about all the slanders and conflicts and manipulations, and it's yeah, you find it in a
Well, I mean,
fiction
let's not
form.
focus on all the negative things. I mean, the most interesting thing about those interviews, the first time that I'm publicly discussing basically paranormal experiences that I've had, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, your childhood, yeah.
far, the paranormal has been a subject of scholarly, and theoretical interest to me. But in this series of interviews, I basically go into, most, if not all, of the rather uncanny experiences I've had from childhood. Everything from basically astral projection and telepathic experiences, clairaudience, precognition, and some experiences that involve, I think, to an extent, the close encounter phenomenon and what's really going on with that. So people who are interested in that should take a look at my YouTube channel and at that series of interviews in particular.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I was definitely fascinated in the book. Again, you've lived quite a rich life. No, no, never a dull time with you, Jason, since you were born.
Yeah. Boredom has not been. I have a lot of problems, but boredom isn't one of them. Hasn't
No,
been one of them.
no. And you were raised Persian was your first language, right?
Yeah, for about what 3 or 4 years, because my parents both worked and they left me in the care of my Persian grandmother, who
Mm.
hardly knew any English. So until I started attending kindergarten, my first language was Persian.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, mine was Portuguese, so I can relate. Well, awesome. Well, check it out, people. Definitely get the book. Check out Jason's channel. We've only scratched the surface from everything. I still have, another 20 pages of notes we could have covered. There's so much. But as always, guys, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it, even for those of you on a Monday mood, if you would. And Jason, it's always great to have you here at the Virtual Alexandria, and you always have a home to come talk about anything. We can talk about Hulk comics and Wonder Woman next time, or whatever you want to talk about.
It's the best atmosphere for conversation that I've ever had, Miguel,
Mm.
and I'm always deeply in your debt for that.
Oh,
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure, and I look forward to the conversation.
all right. Well, have a good night, and everybody have a good day. And as I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Until the next time.